Hey everybody, it's Jason Cruz here once again with another episode of the interview. We are back for the fall, and today's guest is author Michael Thomsen, a writer out of New York City, or actually Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy. I actually met Michael way back when during the UFC evidentiary hearings back in August of 2019. So we are going to talk about his book, Cage Kings: How an Unlikely
Mhm.
Group of Moguls, Champions, and Hustlers Transformed the UFC into a $10 billion industry. Michael, welcome. How you doing?
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to talk to you again.
Great. So now, when we first met, actually was during that time in 2019,
Yeah.
during the UFC antitrust lawsuit. Now you were writing the book. Still, you were working on the book then. Explain to me about how you first wanted to get into writing this particular story.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of a convoluted sort of journey. I'd always been into like boxing and MMA, like growing up. My brother did Taekwondo, and one of my best friends in high school was a pretty advanced Taekwondo player or fighter. I grew up in Central California, which was one of the hives of you know amateur regional MMA promotions. I remember in the '90s they'd go to kickboxing tournaments at Table Mountain outside of Fresno, which is where I grew up. So I'd always been kind of like interested in it, but I was never an MMA like beat reporter or anything like that. So I always just kind of viewed it, like anyone else, as just sort of like a fan. Um, but at a certain point, I think, I got interested in, after Occupy and after, especially the Ferguson uprising, like I got really interested in how sort of our social sort of attitudes about violence get shaped, especially because it seemed to me like when I had grown up in the '90s, fighting was everywhere, not just as like spectacle or TV or Mike Tyson. It was like, you left the house, there's, a 1 in 10 chance you might get messed with, you know, on the street in Fresno. It was sort of like, maybe it's just being younger too. You're much more likely to be in that kind of stuff when you're 17 than when you're, 46 or whatever. Um, but it just felt like something that I suddenly got interested in that, and then I started looking back at my own fandom of boxing, of MMA, um, and I sort of wanted to tell a story about that, and I wasn't really sure what that would be yet. So originally, the book was supposed to be kind of a 300-year history, like almost an anthology book that looked at a different prize fight from different points in history, in different countries. And then, I spent about 6 or 8 months working on that, and it just became too convoluted. So we sort of whittled it down to telling a story about the UFC, which was kind of the most popular and coherent version of like a prize fighting organization today. But I was like, how would you tell the UFC's history in like 12 fights? So I was going to write a chapter of 12 big UFC fights. And then, I spent another 6 months working on that, and my editor at Simon and Schuster was like, you're just overcomplicating this. Why don't you just tell the history of the UFC? Forget the gimmick, the anthology, the sort of like whatever. Just write a straight history of the company and kind of what what you think it means, what were the factors that helped it grow to the state that's in today. And that was really encouraging because I think, I was kind of overcomplicating things, and it kind of felt like I had to sort of have you know, a really sort of like unique sort of insight in, and like, I was kind of bending over backwards to kind of try to do some street magic or something with my brain. Like, aha, did you know that this is what violence really is? And they kind of just encouraged me, like, just tell the story, let the story do the work for you. Don't, trying to overthink things. And so when I got that, that's sort of when it really started snowballing. That
Now,
was
oh, go ahead.
that all happened. That was right around the sale. Like I think the winter after the WME IMG sale, or acquisition. So that would have been like 2017, early 2017.
So you've been working on this for quite a while because this came out in the spring of
Yeah.
2023. Simon Schuster, big publishing house for those that don't know. How did you
Hmm.
pitch this idea to them originally? And then how receptive were they? And I just going through just go through the process. Doesn't have to be the MMA stuff, but just like
Yeah.
a writer trying to pitch a book to a publisher. Um,
Yeah.
the joy and pain of that, mainly pain.
Yeah. Mainly pain. I mean, at that point, I had an agent. I'd had an agent. I'd worked with him for a couple of years. He's a really good friend of mine. And he had helped me with some other stuff in the past. I started my career way back in the 90s. I worked in the movie business for about 5 years, and I had wanted to be a screenwriter when I left school. And so he helped me on a screenwriting project that got optioned, and then we started talking about book ideas, and that's sort of like when the violence thing really stuck out. Um, I came out of the world as a journalist. I sort of covered the video game industry for a long time. That's how I got my sort of formal journalistic kind of reporting start. And so originally I was looking at video game ideas, but I was just so much more interested in fighting, and the culture of fighting and the culture of media surrounding fighting and sports culture. I'd been thinking about that for a long time too. I played football growing up, and I'd been a huge sports fan as a kid. And I'd been thinking about that for a long time because I fell out of sports fandom too. I kind of stuck with fight fandom in part because it's more sporadic. It seemed like a little less exhausting to follow than the NFL, where you just it's all day every week for 6 months out of the year. You're just like obsessed, and that burned me out pretty hard. But I got stuck on this idea that America, we don't have a sports culture, we have a spectator culture, and that there's something really dysfunctional about that. And I think that has a really interesting application in MMA, where I think all the positives that you get out of martial arts culture about respect and humility and learning and yeah, great Hickson Gracie quote about everyone's the same in the gi. The doctor becomes the same as the high school student, which is kind of, something you see in the Nick Diaz story in the book. All the social divisions and the presumptions about who's better, who's worse, who's stronger or not, who's more able. It all just disappears, and it's just the reality of two people. I think all of that is incredibly true in the context of practicing martial arts, but it's something different in watching, and people kind of talk about that a lot too, the just bleed bro or whatever, the drunk guy in the stands, just flying armbar, just go for the armbar. It's like, no, it's not what it is. That was an interesting thing too. So when I had the proposal and I talked, it started with conversations with me and my agent, and then when we got to the point of telling the UFC history in 12 fights, it was still an anthology, but it was sort of, and it wasn't just you, it was going to be Pride and WEC, and it was going to be sort of like modern MMA and in as wide a permutation as we could make it. Then that's when I put together a proposal, which was, I think, two sample chapters and then an outline for the rest of the book. And then he sent that out to every publisher out there, and Simon and Schuster was really interested in it. We had a couple meetings. They brought me in and they liked me, and they said they wanted to publish a book by me, but they wanted it to be not an anthology, because anthologies don't sell. Readers don't like anthologies as a general rule. It's sort of like discombobulating. So they're like, why don't you just retool this a little bit as a straight history instead of the anthology? And that's kind of how it all started.
Now, what I found interesting when I recall talking to you when we first met was how did you obtain the necessary access to write this book?
Slowly, it's just it's there's a
Yeah, because I could just anecdotally talking to the UFC seems very hard. And at the beginning of the book, you talk about how you got to see you got a press pass and was able to go through and watch a card. I think that was Covington
Lawler. Yeah.
Lawler. There you go,
Yeah.
Covington Lawler. Yeah. So how did that come about? Was it the Simon Schuster tie-in, or was it just you just emailing? I forgot who it was at the time, but the
Chris
UFC.
Bellitti, he's still there. I
Oh,
think they
yeah.
promoted him. Yeah. Unless he left recently, but
Well, Dave Schaller was big head, big guy.
yeah, this was after Dave Schaller.
Okay.
But not too far after. I mean, the funny thing is they found me.
Really? Okay.
So yeah, so I um the way I focused on research, I kind of wanted to talk to them last. I wanted to do all my homework first and get as many people outside of the office on the record, former employees, fighters, coaches, um, just so I could be as specific when I did talk to them and ask them as, specific as questions as possible instead of just like, is fighting really in our DNA? Like, do you, I mean,
Yeah.
because they have such a powerful script, and they had at that point in time, Dana and everybody else, it's kind of sunken in, into their own DNA in a way that they could just in their sleep kind of spout out the Zuffa mythology. And like, we ran toward regulation. We ran towards, they didn't run towards antitrust regulation apparently, but they ran towards, the commissioners to kind of, smooth that over for themselves. But yeah, I wanted to be as prepared as possible and then have that be the last stop before just putting the whole draft together. And then, they could comment on everything I had that would be in the book and give them an opportunity to sort of push back on people's claims or tell their perspective of different stories that had happened. So I was about a year into doing that, and I requested an interview from someone who wound up turning me down. I can't even remember his name at this point, but he was one of their not cybersecurity guys, but he was originally a Zuffa employee, and he kind of tracked online piracy. So he was sort of monitoring internet traffic internally as a Zuffa employee to kind of track down, streaming sites or different like torrent kind of groups or whatever. And then I think after the sale, I don't know if he was laid off or he quit, but he spun off and started his own kind of cybersecurity, online piracy consulting business. And he kept working with Zuffa. And so I wanted to talk to him just about the logistics of that, how big an impact it had on their business. And in retrospect, it wouldn't have been that big a piece of the book, or might not even have made it in. But, just as researching, I wanted to talk to him because it sounded interesting. But because he was still working with Zuffa, he just forwarded my email to the UFC. And then they wrote me back like, are you writing a book? Let's talk. And then so that's sort of like how we started talking. So, it was a little bit early for me in the process, but their timeline too is like we wound up talking for about 8 months before, I think that was like March or April of the year where the evidentiary hearing happened, where we had met. It was 2019. So I think from like March through September, we were kind of like negotiating, and they'd promised me interviews with a bunch of people, including Dana, and they said they would help connect me to the Fertitas and a bunch of other people internal at the UFC. And they gave me a Lawrence Epstein interview and Mark Ratner, the two kind of safest people, the most like adult kind of like Ratner's not a lawyer, but he was the executive director of the commission in Nevada. So he understands how to kind of not step in it when he talks. And Epstein's a lawyer, so he was very, very well put together, very safe interview for them. Yeah, and then it all just kind of like slowly kind of, they just slowly ghosted. I think it's, probably something that happens to most people trying to cover the UFC and expecting to get anything from them. They just sort of, stop responding.
Yeah.
It's not even like acrimonious. It's just sort of like, So like after the Lawler Covington fight, I'd spoken with the UFC about going to the next pay-per-view on my own dime. It was in Anaheim. I had bought a ticket. I flew out to Anaheim, and I wanted to the New Jersey Lawler Covington thing. It was like really last minute. I didn't get to go to the like fight day, the Wednesday media event where all the fighters line up. So I was like, I'd like to go to a couple events as part of the research and do the fight interviews and just see the logistics, not just on the night, but the whole week leading up to it, and talk to all the different contractors that the UFC uses to put on those productions, from the truck delivery guys to everyone else. And then I got out to Anaheim for that next event. That was a Stipe Cormier rematch where Nate Diaz fought Anthony Pettis, and I was just not on the press list. So I just showed up, and I started texting with the UFC, and they're just like, sorry, don't know what to tell you. And part of this trip, this was sort of the last big research trip I was going to take before really going into writing and editing mode. But that was the same trip where after that pay-per-view, that's where we met in Vegas, because I took the bus from Anaheim to Vegas after that pay-per-view weekend. And that was when the evidentiary hearing was. But part of that Vegas trip, I was going to hopefully interview Dana. And so I'd flown out to Vegas in May to interview Dana and a bunch of other people, and that got canceled at the last minute. So I just wound up sitting in Vegas trying to like come up with something to do. And then, I had booked a stay in Vegas again. I was like going to go to the evidentiary hearing, was going to try and do another interview. And then it just, evaporated. And so I was like, well, I guess they're done with me. They sort of.
Did you get to talk to anybody during the evidentiary hearings, whether it be the UFC lawyers, the plaintiffs' lawyers, any of the fighters? Were they accessible to you, or were they more like "mum's the word" because we're doing the legal? I mean, they were their lawyers.
No one on the record, nothing substantial. I tried to definitely not the UFC side. I think they're pretty buttoned down. I had a brief message chain with Rob Macy a few years ago where I was trying to talk to him. But then at a certain point, I kind of realized I had more of what I needed from just the discovery, because the antitrust suit kind of fits into the timeline of the tail end of the book. Even though it was sort of initiated it in 2013, didn't really become a big public thing until 2015, 2016. And that's kind of its own story now. In a way, it was still sort of very, very, they're still fighting over venue. I think back then it was sort of, it was super preliminary. So I wasn't really sure how to fit it into the timeline without doing some sleight of hand with what was really happening at that time. But the discovery was super helpful, and I knew that outside of that there wasn't going to be a lot Macy could say outside of he thinks they broke antitrust law. Now the judge kind of agrees with him, said pretty openly that they abused their position to gain an unfair advantage in the market.
How did you go about obtaining, because the book is really great as far as getting into a lot of the business decisions that happened early on. I think one of the interesting points is how they got the deal together for The Ultimate Fighter to be on Spike TV. I thought that was a very interesting point. How did you go about trailing that information or tracking it down?
That was a lot easier to get, actually. Kevin Kay was executive at Spike at the time, who was in charge of programming for the channel, and he's very open. He's a very accessible
He is,
source.
to be honest with you. He returned an email to me, so yes, he is very.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He likes talking. He's not part of that sort of reality distortion field that I think Zuffa sometimes, or UFC Holdings now, or whatever you call it, that they kind of get around people. He's for him, it's like a piece of history that he was involved in, and there's no reason not to talk about it. openly and honestly. I spoke to Albie Heck too, who has moved on. He does children's entertainment stuff now, but he was the lead executive at Viacom. That was sort of he was Kevin K's direct report. He was kind of Kevin K's boss, and he was the link between Kevin K and Tom Freston, who ran all of Viacom at that point. Um, so those kinds of people will talk. It's like the coaches, they'll talk to you. The fighters, most of the fighters will talk to you. Like it's just when you start getting closer into the UFC world, the full-time employees, people in the Fertitta world, that it kind of everyone gets a lot more guarded. Even I spoke to some former UFC employees, and even some of them were very reluctant to speak on the record, even though they didn't necessarily have anything like smoking gun bad to say. I spoke to one person that had been fired, and they were still kind of begrudgingly respectful about Dana White. Like, they're like, he's all the things that people criticize him for being, but he succeeded. And, they didn't treat me fairly, but, I kind of respect what they did with the company. Even still, it's a strange phenomenon in a lot of ways.
So how receptive were fighters to you? I assume you tracked down several fighters and told them you were writing a book. How receptive were they about sharing their story?
Um, most the less famous ones were the most receptive. I tried Randy Couture is the main character, and I tried, I think, harder than anyone else to get connected to Randy, and he's not inaccessible. He'll talk to other people, but I think he's just very closed off with who he talks to now in media, whether that's just he doesn't want to talk to non-MMA people unless you're like really kind of famous, like the Dan Le Batards or whatever the big sports talk people are. But he would not talk to me. But the people under that tier, under the couture level, they're pretty open. They have nothing, they like the attention for the most part. And you can really feel the sort of structure as independent contractors. The UFC does it. They have a powerful financial sway over most fighters, but a lot of fighters are, especially X5 people like Philippe Nover, I quote a lot in the book. He was the first person I spoke to, actually. He was my very first interview when I
Is he
started.
still in? I remember him for the Ultimate Fighter. They used to call him the next Anderson Silva. He was a nurse in New York City.
Yeah.
Is he
Yeah.
still a nurse in New York City?
He's still a nurse. He just got a new degree. I think he's a full RN now. I think.
Oh, great. That's good for him.
Yeah. So yeah, he's all set now. He's doing really well. He looked really happy, and he still trains. At least when I spoke to him, and he was still cornering UFC fighters.
Oh, okay.
And but he was very open, and he was not. He didn't like mince words, but he wasn't bitter either. He felt like them cutting him after the Ultimate Fighter. He lost in the finale, and then he lost two, and so they cut him before his contract was up. It was a kind of a typical like prospect arc where he was a really good striker and really good at jujitsu, but could not deal with wrestlers. It's kind of the old MMA like trump card, like very few people can actually hang with all American wrestlers, no matter how developed you are, if you're not at a certain level in grappling. Even with jujitsu, it's not enough in a lot of cases. But then he went, he fought in the regionals for a while and came back when they re-signed him, and he was very grateful for the fact that they brought him back. They had, I think, the first event they ever did in the Philippines.
Philippines, and he did the same part as Mark Munoz's retirement. Yeah.
Yeah. So they gave him a second chance, and I think he had 4 more fights, and he was grateful for that. But it was just, wrong time. He was older. His body was starting to fall apart, and his sort of commitment was. I remember him telling me, I think I ended up cutting this out of the book. It's been a while since I checked. There was a draft where I had this quote because I thought it really um, summed up a lot of things about the UFC's attitude to fighters. But he said when they cut him the second time, or I think he retired. He retired after the if he fought Rick Glenn in the Holly Holm Jermaine Durandamy fight in Brooklyn. So I was there live. I saw that one live too. I think he retired after that, but he stayed. He was cornering what do you call it? David. Oh my god, I'm blanking on his name. He's still connected with like Sarah Longo, and he trained with a lot of people and would be in the corner. You'd still see him on UFC broadcasts cornering people, but they canceled his Fight Pass subscription. So everyone at that time on the roster would get a complimentary Fight Pass subscription
Okay.
to
Yeah.
watch tape. And as soon as he retired, he couldn't even watch his own fights, and he couldn't watch tape for his teammates to help them get ready for fights. Um, and he wasn't bitter about that, but it's just like, I know I didn't become a superstar or anything, but it's like a $10 a month subscription. You can't just like, it's literally just a button you hit in a back end server. It's not even costing them extra money. It's just, he felt that was really petty. And, I mean, it's kind of right. If like you don't have pension, you don't have long-term health care. I mean, the absolute bare minimum least you could do is just like keep the Fight Pass subscription turned on as a gift to all 2,000, 3,000 fighters that have been in the UFC. It's sort of like, hey, you're still part of the family in some abstract way. I mean, it's almost like I don't think they've ever done this, but it'd be like asking someone to return their fight kit. You retired now. Okay, send us back all your Reebok gear, all
Send
your
it all
Venom
back.
gear
That's
now. That's
crazy.
actually UFC property. It's not your property.
So I wanted to talk about the book in terms of the narratives. I thought
Yeah.
there were great narratives. Randy Couture we mentioned, Nick Diaz. Yeah, Nick and Nick
Nick,
Diaz. I guess
Nick and Nick. Yeah.
Nick Moore, and then Ronda Rousey. I just went over that. Those were some of the more interesting backstories for the book. How did you obtain those backstories? I mean, did you get to talk to the Diaz brothers? How did that go come about?
No, I didn't get to talk to the Diaz brother. They were the closest though, because I got to talk to everyone around them. I talked to
Okay.
Caesar Gracie and Richard Perez and Steve Heath, who was, the OG that got them all sort of in. And, apparently, I don't know if anyone listening, apparently, I didn't know this at the time either. Steve Heath fought Chuck Liddell in that brief period where Liddell left the UFC. This was one of Dana White's big ideas before he was running the UFC, when he was still a fight manager. He advised Chuck to not take a lowball offer from John Peretti, who was a UFC matchmaker at the time. And he took him to the IFC instead. And he got a one fight deal in the IFC, and Liddell won the championship. And the champion at the time was Steve Heath. He
Oh,
knocked him out in a second round head kick. Steve's the guy that got Nick into MMA. He was training at the Animal House, which was kind of the home base of Shamrock 2000. This turns into Game of Thrones at a certain point too. You realize like, MMA is such a tiny world.
right.
It's like 6 degrees to Frank Shamrock. Like everyone is, or Bob Shamrock, I guess he's the real mastermind in a lot of ways. Yeah, so I was able to get to a bunch of people around them. They don't talk to the media unless you have a
Now,
previous
how about
relationship with them.
Ronda Rousey? I mean, was that kind of a hard narrative to kind of put piece together? I mean, she seems very, or that whole camp seems very tight,
Closed off. Yeah.
yeah, closed off, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to talk to her either, but her and Conor McGregor, who's the other main character, like that
Oh yeah,
point, it became, there was so much previously published material about them that like it was, and they've spoken about their stories for enough profile. It gets to the point where they're repeating them. And, with Rhonda, she'd written a memoir herself and kind of went through everything. So, that hit a point where it was sort of like, for content that's ultimately just going to fill like one chapter. It's going to be like 10, 15 pages in this larger narrative, and she doesn't talk to the media. Like she's got a very small list of people that she trusts. And she has a relationship with Dana, and she has a relationship with WME Endeavor now. So there's just not a lot of incentive or interest from that point. But she's spoken about her interest in what got her into MMA very candidly, I think, and what she hoped to get out of it, what her disappointments were. With that kind of stuff, you just kind of try and take people at their word, what they've said publicly about this sort of stuff, and try and fit it into this puzzle of like what was happening with the company, what the financial incentives were in the marketplace, outside of what was going on with the UFC, what these larger conglomerates like Viacom or Disney or CBS, what the big cable companies in the 90s were. I was really interested in sort of the origins of pay-per-view as a market too, kind of before this period we're all kind of familiar with now, but like where it came from in the 70s and 80s and how it sort of transitioned from that closed circuit television world, where you'd go to like a movie theater to watch Ali versus Inoki or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now you could just order it in your living room. And the amount of work that had to go into that, it's sort of, I didn't realize, but Campbell McLaren was another guy I spoke to. And when they launched the UFC in 93, you couldn't just get pay-per-view through your normal cable box. You had to actually request a separate box that would plug into the cable box, because the technology was still old, and the idea of pay-per-view was still kind of like an add-on to the original concept of subscription TV. So they kind of had to jump through two hoops at once to sell a show. They had to get people to call their cable operators and pay to get that separate pay-per-view box. So there's a way in which the programming isn't just selling itself, but it's selling this sort of like idea of a larger media ecosystem, and it's getting people to buy in, not just to like the UFC broadcasts, but like, you see it even today, but they're selling ESPN Plus subscriptions, and the UFC is a part of, what they promote as like the, value proposition in that. But it's sort of like they really want you to be a part of the streaming audience that's just going to like automatically let them toll your credit card for $10 a month or whatever it is, even if you're not watching.
Yeah.
I think that's why they don't care that ratings are so bad, because like it doesn't matter anymore. They don't really get paid for a number of people streaming a fight night from the Apex Center, as long as the people don't click cancel at the end of the month. Like, it's money in the bank.
Yeah, I definitely think you make a good point, because one of the things that used to happen is just a report on ratings used to be a negative impact, but now that you have these streaming options, no one gets those internal numbers unless they feed it to us, right, as media.
Yeah.
So that's been optimal for them. Question for you, as far as the UFC's merger with WWE making TKO, how do you see that merger going, and how do you think that affects the UFC in terms of their business?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll just say up front, I know the least about the WWE's business model. Like everything I kind of know, materially about them, I learned through the UFC and side of reach. Like I did get a copy of an old fight contract from 2000, which is, I think, part of what Lorenzo Fertitta used to talk about, modeling the UFC after the WWF's business model. And Joe Silva used to talk about that too. And there's a lot of eerily similar provisions in those early wrestler contracts. I think about the merger in a couple of the first thought is they're both saturated, kind of mature companies at this point. I like the UFC will probably see revenue to continue growing for the next several years, but I don't think their audience reach is growing anymore. In a lot of ways, I think it's sort of declining. If you look at, I think it was, I forget. I was reading the Hollywood Reporter story about this that came out last week. Or was a Variety, one of the trade papers, and
Right.
I think Endeavor now lists the global audience for the UFC as like 700 million, and before the WME acquisition in 2016, it was like 817. You look at Zuffa, when they submitted the request to develop the land where the new office is sitting on down there in the south part of Vegas. They said they had a global audience. I think 800 million, 815 million, or something like that. So I think there's some audience shrinkage that's happening. So you know they're at a mature point as a company. So the real question is, how can they increase their margins from this set audience, a captive audience that may just be on the tip of declining bit by bit. And so I think coupling them with another mature audience that has a very loyal, or a mature company that has a very loyal audience, um, will give Endeavor tools to kind of keep revenue growing on paper. Because you could go to Nemiroff Vodka and say, how about a 2-for-1? If you're thinking of canceling your sponsorship with the UFC, what if you give us 50% more, but we'll put you on WWE programming too? And now you're on 2 different cable networks, you're on 2 different streaming subscriptions, you get 2 different audience reaches. And then so they can sort of look at that and say, we're booking 50% increase on sponsorships, just, as a general kind of target. It gives them a chance, it gives them more leverage to create paper growth, for the revenues, even if let's say the cultural reach of both of these companies are sort of fixed at this point. They're sort of set, maybe declining. WWE has been in decline for a while, but it still has a very loyal audience. It's going to keep them above a certain sort of ratings threshold and pay-per-view buy threshold. Ari Emanuel, I think he's also like, he's weirdly cagey about a lot of the reporting that says that Endeavor is dependent on the UFC for its revenues. Like they have no real, they're not like a viable company without the UFC's like massive annual like revenue feeding them and like helping to set up all of these other acquisitions. So like you hear little notes of defiance when he talks about the merger. He's like, you're saying we can't do it alone. Well, we'll spin off the UFC into its own company, and then we can see how Endeavor does alone. We'll see if investors still think Endeavor is viable, as its own sort of like standalone entity. Obviously, they're still invested in the UFC and they're still the majority shareholder. But I think there's a little bit of ego involved in that too. But yeah, to me, it's just a sign that sort of the growth period is over. Now it's about margins and leverage, and it's not really that sort of gold rush that we lived through with the Ultimate Fighter, 2007, like 2008, like first UFC fighter to host a Saturday Night Live show, first UFC fighter to be on, the Tonight Show or whatever. Even though they used to do that way back when Jay Leno used to have Tito Ortiz on, like pre Ultimate Fighter, pre like, so yeah, but we'll see. We'll see. It's an interesting, and maybe he uses that bundle to get, I mean, one of the things you saw with the ESPN deal with UFC is he's very open to carving up the programming schedule to different platforms, so that's streaming or ESPN linear or ABC. And I think this just gives him even more options. Like, what if we give you a WWE night, a UFC night, and we give one to Amazon, we give one to ESPN, we give one to Fox. And so it lets all the broadcasters sort of like not have to pay, egregiously more than they're paying already, while still giving him a total kind of like win. We can say, well, the total package is still higher than it was before. And so
Yeah.
everyone gets to win with that.
Do you think that that UFC will stay on ESPN with their next media deal? I that's one of the interesting things that I see. WWE just is moving off a network to
Yeah.
back to the USA network. But ESPN, I mean, UFC and ESPN, I mean, ESPN has been doing backflips over how great the UFC has propped up its digital platform. But do you see the UFC moving off of it to look for a better deal or re-up with ESPN?
Um, I think the value of being attached to ESPN is so high that they'll find a way to stay connected in some way. But I think the days of the UFC being exclusive to any one network are probably waning. I mean, this was sort of in the WWF heyday too. They sort of split their media rights across, multiple channels. There's TNT and Spike and FX, and that everyone got a specific piece. That's how the NFL always liked to do it. I think that was sort of the long-term vision the Fertitas had, was sort of like, we can get money out of everybody if we get a yearly programming kind of schedule that's like robust enough. You saw early parts of that in their negotiations with HBO in 2006 and 2007, where they imagined like, we'll do Spike fight nights, we'll do a sort of like contender night on HBO once a month or once every 2 months, and then we'll do the pay-per-views like we always do, and then we'll have shoulder programming, the news, and all that kind of stuff. And I think they're probably going to try and do something similar. They might, carve out. They're doing all these original documentary series on Fight Pass now. Like, some of which are really good actually, and like they don't promote them at all. Like, if you ever just forget you have a Fight Pass subscription and like scroll back into the website,
Very
like
good.
there's stuff there that, like, oh my god, I didn't know they had done any of this, because they don't market it. But that's a library that they could go take to DAZN or something. We'll do like, that's, they'll probably not sign a deal with DAZN, but like Amazon, for instance. So you do like Amazon originals and do their own version of 30 for 30 with Jens Pulver, whoever, like one of the some of the original guys that sort of like had to retire before they could really cash out on the company becoming so famous. What's going on with Tank Abbott now? Who wouldn't want to watch a Tank Abbott special? Or the Shamrock sort of dynasty, like all the different layers that sort of wove in and out of early UFC and early Pride history, and just the history of Bob Shamrock's place for all those wards of the state, the young kids that had to go live with them.
For a while,
Um,
they did do those "Where Are They Now"
yeah,
episodes. So, like, I thought that was very interesting. Like, they did one on Ivan Salivary, who is up here, and seeing and just going on about how like his move to Salivary is something Joe Rogan always talks about, and
yeah,
how it was with Tito Ortiz, what we're training with him. I mean, it's just very very informative and interesting. It's just, yeah, it's there. It's just not not to the front of the mind, but yeah.
yeah, and it's that stuff is buried right now in Fight Pass. But I think that was sort of, they've always kept Fight Pass in their back pocket. I think is this something they can like build up or not, depending on what they need to do for their business. But now Amazon's, I mean, the scuttlebutt was Amazon was a contender for bidding before they signed the ESPN deals. Maybe they'll revisit it. Um, who knows? But my guess will be that they'll probably stay with ESPN because that's such a powerful marketing machine. They have their own news site, they have their own linear cable channel, which, even as people, cable's just never coming back, but it's still going to be tens of millions of homes that you can just put a commercial onto, and now 40 million people know that you have a pay-per-view next week or whatever.
Yeah.
That's always going to be powerful. And the UFC has a loyal audience. It's a small audience, where they're really like loyal hardcore, but like, if there's at a certain point, even if you're doing 300,000 or 400,000 viewers on a weekday for, an Ultimate Fighter, broadcast, that's not nothing in terms of linear cable. That's not the top of the tier in terms of um, advertiser revenue for a cable channel, but it would be enough to keep a company going for at a certain scale. So I think as long as they don't get too greedy and price themselves out, there'll be a way to keep that association going. What I don't see is there being another cable channel like Fox Sports came in really hungry after the Spike deal and they just outbid Spike. I don't think there's going to be a cable network that's going to outbid ESPN, that's going to spend even more. I think it's at the point of having to carve up an increase in overall media licensing from a wider number of partners and international. In a lot, they're a different company in different countries. And I think that's something that's easy to lose track of from the U.S. But they might be a much more exciting cable proposition in Polish TV, or Russian TV or Chinese TV. Everyone wants to crack China, Japan or wherever it is.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for your time. It's Michael Thomsen. The book, Cage Kings: How an Unlikely Group of Moguls, Champions, and Hustlers Transformed the UFC into a $10 billion industry. You could look it up at Amazon or other places where you are purchasing books. Simon and Schuster is the publisher. What are you working on next, Michael?
Well, that's what I ask myself every morning when I get I have a couple of stories about the UFC I'm working on right now. Today I'm editing a story that I think is going to come out in the Atlantic about whether men and women will fight each other ever in the UFC. It's sort of, it's always been there. Ronda Rousey used to have to talk about it all the time. Chris Cyborg would have to talk about it. So I'm just sort of like looking a little more detailed at like whether that's even possible legally or culturally, like and why anyone would want to do that in the first place. And then that's about it. I'm kind of slowly I'd like to write more about the antitrust suit. If it actually goes to trial, maybe we can hang out again.
We all would.
Trial date holds down. Yeah, I missed the legendary triple Hennessy that I heard you had to chug down.
Yeah, it was not fun. I mean, no, it was no. I take that back. It was fine. It was fine.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel it. That's all.
Yeah.
But Michael, thank you very much for your time. We look forward to seeing what's up next for you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for your time.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.